I've always been the type of person who enjoys long drives alone. There's something therapeutic about the open road, the music, and just having time to think. But after what happened to me last October, I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same way about driving at night again. I was making my way back home to Phoenix from a business conference in Denver. It was a route I'd taken dozens of times before, straight down through Colorado Springs, then across the seemingly endless stretches of highway through New Mexico. I prefer driving at night because there's less traffic, and the cooler air is easier on my old Honda's overworked air conditioning system. Everything was normal until I stopped for coffee and gas in a small town called Raton, right on the Colorado-New Mexico border. It was one of those typical roadside stops, a combination gas station and convenience store with flickering neon signs and that particular smell of stale coffee and diesel fuel. The clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when I pulled up to pump number 3. As I was filling up my tank, I noticed a white pickup truck at the pump across from me. Nothing unusual about it at first glance, looked like any other work truck you'd see in that part of the country. But something about the driver caught my attention. He was just sitting there in his cab, not pumping gas, not going inside, just watching me. When our eyes met through his windshield, he quickly looked away and started fumbling with something on his dashboard. I finished filling up, paid inside, and grabbed a large coffee for the road. The clerk was a tired-looking woman who barely acknowledged my presence, which was fine by me. I just wanted to get back on the highway and put some more miles behind me before I got too sleepy. When I walked back outside, the white pickup was gone. I felt a small wave of relief that I hadn't even realized I needed. I got back in my car, adjusted my rearview mirror, and pulled back onto the highway heading south. For the first 20 minutes or so, I saw nothing but darkness in my mirrors. The highway was almost completely empty, which wasn't unusual for that time of night in that part of the country. I had my music playing softly and was actually starting to relax when I noticed headlights approaching from behind. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cars catch up to each other on highways all the time. But as the vehicle got closer, something felt off. The headlights seemed to be positioned exactly like those of a pickup truck, and they weren't making any move to pass me despite having a clear left lane. I slowed down from 75 to 65 mph, expecting the truck to go around me. Instead, it slowed down too, maintaining the same distance behind me. When I sped back up to 80, so did the truck. When I dropped down to 55, the truck matched my speed perfectly. My hands started to sweat on the steering wheel. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe it was just someone who preferred following another car's taillights instead of navigating the dark highway alone. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next town wasn't for another 45 miles. And out here, 45 miles might as well be 100. Nothing but scrubland, distant mountains silhouetted against the stars, and the occasional abandoned building that looked like it had been forgotten by civilization decades ago. I decided to test my suspicions. I put on my right turn signal and moved into the right lane, even though there was no reason to do so. The pickup immediately followed, staying exactly 3 car lengths behind me. I signaled left and moved back. The pickup mirrored my movement perfectly. That's when I started to panic. I reached for my phone, hoping to call 911, but of course there was no signal. Out here in the middle of nowhere, cell towers were as rare as gas stations. I was completely on my own with whatever this person wanted from me. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and I found myself checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. The pickup's headlights had become like 2 unblinking eyes staring at me through the darkness. I couldn't see the driver. The headlights were too bright and positioned too high, but I could feel their presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Mile after mile, the truck stayed with me. When I passed the occasional semi-truck or rare late-night traveler, I considered trying to get their attention somehow, But how do you signal to another driver that you're being followed? Flash your lights? Honk your horn? It all seemed inadequate and potentially dangerous. About an hour into this nightmare, I saw salvation ahead, the glow of lights from what looked like a truck stop. As I got closer, I could see it was one of those 24-hour travel centers with multiple gas pumps, a restaurant, and hopefully other people around. I had never been so happy to see artificial light in my entire life. I put on my turn signal early, hoping against hope that the pickup would continue straight on the highway. But of course, it followed me into the truck stop parking lot. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The travel center was busier than I expected for midnight on a weekday. There were several semi-trucks parked in the designated areas and a few cars scattered around the gas pumps. I pulled up to a pump near the main building, right under a bright security light, and sat there for a moment trying to figure out what to do. The pickup had parked about 50 feet away, near the edge of the lot where the lighting was dimmer. I still couldn't make out much about the driver, but I could see the silhouette of someone sitting behind the wheel, and they seemed to be watching me. I decided I had to act. I couldn't just sit there all night, and I couldn't keep driving with this person following me for hundreds more miles. I got out of my car, making sure to lock it, and walked quickly toward the main building. There were security cameras everywhere, and the place was well lit. If this person wanted to try something, they'd have to do it in full view of multiple cameras and potential witnesses. Inside, the place had that harsh fluorescent lighting that makes everything look sterile and slightly surreal. There was a clerk behind the counter, a heavy-set man with a gray beard who looked like he'd been working night shifts for years. A couple of truck drivers were browsing the snack aisles, and there was a family with young kids getting drinks from the cooler. I approached the counter and tried to sound casual. "Hey, I think someone might be following me. Is there any chance I could use your phone to call the police?" The clerk looked up from his magazine with immediate concern. "Following you? What kind of vehicle?" "White pickup. He's been behind me for over an hour, matching my speed, following me into your parking lot. He's parked out there right now." The clerk glanced toward the windows, then reached for the phone behind the counter. "Let me call the local sheriff's department. We get weird stuff out here sometimes. People think the middle of nowhere means they can do whatever they want." While he was making the call, I pretended to browse the coffee area, but kept watching the parking lot through the windows. The pickup was still there, still in the same spot. I couldn't tell if anyone was inside anymore because of the angle and the lighting. The clerk finished his call and walked over to me. "Deputy's about 15 minutes out. He said to stay inside until he gets here. You want some coffee? On the house." I accepted gratefully and found myself actually able to relax slightly for the first time in over an hour. The presence of other people, the bright lights, the promise of law enforcement on the way, it all helped calm my nerves. But then I looked out the window again, and the pickup was gone. I felt a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. Part of me was glad the threat seemed to be over, but another part of me wondered if I had overreacted. Maybe it really had been a coincidence. Maybe the driver had just been tired and was using my taillights to help navigate the dark highway. The deputy arrived exactly when the clerk said he would. A professional-looking man in his 40s who took my statement seriously and didn't make me feel like I was wasting his time. He said they'd had reports of suspicious activity on that stretch of highway before, and that I had done the right thing by stopping somewhere public and well lit. He offered to escort me to the next major town, but I declined. The pickup was gone, I had a full tank of gas, and there would be more traffic as I got closer to Albuquerque. I thanked everyone and got back on the road, feeling foolish but also relieved. For the next 2 hours, my drive was blissfully normal. I saw the usual mix of late-night travelers, a few semis, some cars with out-of-state plates, probably making their own long journeys. The radio played softly, and I was actually starting to enjoy the drive again. Then, just as I was passing through a particularly desolate stretch about 30 miles north of Santa Fe, I saw them again in my rearview mirror. The same headlight configuration, the same distance behind me, matching my speed perfectly. This time, I didn't hesitate.
I immediately started looking for the next exit, the next source of light, the next place where there might be other people. But this section of highway was even more isolated than where I'd been followed before. Nothing but darkness stretching in every direction. The pickup stayed with me for another 20 miles. Every time I checked my mirror, those headlights were there, steady and patient. I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, and I could feel sweat running down my back despite the air conditioning. Finally, I saw signs for a rest area ahead. It wasn't much, just a small parking area with some picnic tables and bathroom facilities, but it had lighting, and more importantly, it was state-maintained property where the pickup driver would be taking a bigger risk if he tried anything.
I pulled into the rest area and parked right under the brightest light I could find. The pickup followed me in, but stayed near the entrance, engine running. We sat there like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Then, to my complete shock, the pickup started moving toward me. Not fast, but deliberately. I could finally see into the cab as it got closer, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was no one driving the truck. I'm not talking about someone slouched down or hidden from view. The driver's seat was completely empty. The truck was moving on its own, with no human being controlling it. I sat there frozen, watching this impossible thing happening right in front of me. The pickup rolled slowly past my car, and as it did, I could see into the bed of the truck. There were tools scattered around. Shovels, rope, what looked like a tarp, and sitting in the middle of it all was a small pile of women's clothing. The truck continued past me and pulled back onto the highway, disappearing into the darkness, as if it had never been there at all. I sat in that rest area until the sun came up, too terrified to move. When dawn finally broke and I could see everything clearly in the daylight, I drove straight to the nearest police station in Santa Fe and told them everything. The officer who took my statement was patient and professional, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. How do you explain a driverless truck following you on the highway? How do you describe something that defies every law of physics and common sense? They took down all the details, including the license plate number I had managed to memorize. A few days later, they called me back. The plate belonged to a white pickup truck registered to a man named Marcus Valdez. Marcus had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier after failing to return from a hunting trip in the mountains near Colorado Springs. They found his truck a week later crashed in a ravine, about 40 miles from where he was last seen. Marcus was still inside, and the coroner estimated he had been dead for at least 3 weeks. The same amount of time, people had been reporting sightings of a white pickup truck following lone drivers on that stretch of highway at night. I never did find out what happened to the women's clothing they found in the back of Marcus's truck when they pulled it from that ravine. The police said there were multiple sets, different sizes, different styles. They're still investigating. I finished my drive home the next day, taking a completely different route that added 4 hours to my trip. I don't care. I will never drive that stretch of highway again, especially not at night. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone after dark, I catch myself checking my rearview mirror more often than I used to. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see a familiar set of headlights maintaining that perfect distance behind me.
I was 19 when this happened, young and maybe a little too trusting for my own good. My older sister had just gotten married and moved to a small town in rural Montana, about 8 hours from where I was going to college in Seattle. This was back in 2019, and I had decided to surprise her with a visit during my spring break. The drive started out great. I had my favorite playlist, a car full of snacks, and that feeling of freedom that only comes from being young and on the open road. But as the hours passed and I got further from civilization, the landscape became increasingly desolate. Rolling hills covered in brown grass, the occasional abandoned farmhouse, and mile after mile of two-lane highway with nothing but fence posts to mark the way. It was getting close to sunset when I realized I had made a serious miscalculation. My gas gauge was sitting just above empty, and according to my GPS, the next town wasn't for another 30 miles. I started to panic a little, doing that mental math every driver knows. How many miles can I get on what's left in the tank? Just when I was starting to seriously worry about being stranded on this lonely stretch of road, I saw something that looked like a mirage. A small cluster of buildings appeared on the horizon, and as I got closer, I could make out the familiar shape of gas pumps and a hand-painted sign that read Prairie Rose Station, last gas for 50 miles. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The gas pumps were the old kind where you had to go inside to pay first, and the main building was a combination of convenience store, diner, and what looked like a small motel attached to the back. There were only 2 other vehicles in the parking lot, an old Buick that looked like it had been there for years, and a rusty pickup truck that had seen better days. I pulled up to the pumps and immediately felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Something about this place felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way the windows were tinted so dark you couldn't see inside, or the fact that there were no other customers visible anywhere despite the open sign glowing in the window. I walked inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell, a mixture of old grease, cigarette smoke, and something else I couldn't identify. Something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn slightly. The interior was dimly lit by a few fluorescent bulbs that flickered intermittently, casting weird shadows on the walls lined with dusty merchandise that looked like it had been sitting there for decades. Behind the counter stood a man who looked to be in his 50s, thin and pale with dark hair that was slicked back with too much pomade. But it was his smile that made my skin crawl. It was too wide, too eager, like he was genuinely excited to see me in a way that felt completely inappropriate for a gas station clerk greeting a customer. "Well, hello there, sweetie," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "Don't get many pretty young ladies stopping by here, especially not this late in the day." I forced myself to smile politely and asked to prepay for $20 worth of gas. As I handed him the cash, his fingers lingered against mine longer than necessary, and I noticed his fingernails were unusually long for a man and stained with something dark. "You traveling alone?" he asked, still wearing that unsettling grin. "That's not real safe for a young girl like yourself. Lots of dangerous people out there on these back roads." "I'm meeting my boyfriend just up the road," I lied quickly, hoping to discourage whatever he might be thinking. "He's expecting me any minute." His smile faltered slightly, but then returned even whiter than before. "Well, that's good. Real good. You be careful out there now." I practically ran back to my car and started pumping gas as quickly as possible. Through the store windows, I could see the clerk watching me, that same disturbing smile still plastered on his face. I kept telling myself to just finish filling up and get out of there as fast as possible. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Next to the old Buick in the parking lot, there was a small pile of personal belongings scattered on the ground. A purse, some clothes, what looked like a cell phone with a cracked screen. And on the car's rear window, written in what looked like dust or grime, were the words, "Help ME" in desperate, shaky letters. My hands were trembling as I finished pumping gas. I wanted to investigate the car more closely, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from this place as fast as possible. I screwed the gas cap back on and was walking toward my car door when I heard the bell above the station door chime. The clerk was walking toward me, no longer behind the safety of his counter. In his hand was something that glinted in the dim light, a knife, or maybe a screwdriver. I couldn't tell for sure, but I didn't wait to find out. I jumped into my car and turned the key, praying it would start on the first try. The engine turned over, and I threw it into drive, my tires squealing as I peeled out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, I could see the clerk standing in the middle of the lot, watching me leave with that same horrible smile. I drove for the next hour without stopping, constantly checking my mirrors for any sign that I was being followed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel steady. When I finally reached the next town, a real town with streetlights and chain restaurants and normal people, I pulled into the first well-lit parking lot I found and sat there until my heart rate returned to normal. I called my sister from there and told her I was running late, that I'd had car trouble. I didn't want to worry her, and honestly, I wasn't sure she'd believe me if I told her the truth. The whole thing seemed surreal, like something out of a horror movie rather than real life. But I couldn't shake the image of that car with "Help ME" written on the window, or the pile of belongings scattered on the ground. Someone had been in trouble at that station, and I had just driven away. When I got to my sister's house the next morning, I convinced her to let me use her computer to look up the Prairie Rose station online. What I found made me sick to my stomach. There were forum posts and review sites with dozens of reports about the place going back years. Women reporting feeling uncomfortable or unsafe there. Stories about belongings found in the parking lot. Several mentions of missing persons last seen in the area. But the most disturbing thing I found was a news article from just 2 months before my visit. A 22-year-old college student named Sarah Martinez had disappeared while driving home to Colorado for winter break. Her car had been found abandoned at a gas station, matching the exact description of Prairie Rose Station. She was never found. I immediately called the Montana State Police and told them everything I had seen. They said they were familiar with the location and had been investigating it for some time, but hadn't been able to gather enough evidence for a search warrant. 3 weeks later, my sister called me with an update she'd seen on the local news. The Prairie Rose Station had been raided by police as part of a multi-state investigation into a series of disappearances along remote highways. They'd found evidence of multiple crimes in a basement area beneath the main building that I never knew existed. The clerk, whose real name was Dennis Wayne Kowalski, had been arrested and charged with kidnapping, assault, and murder. They found personal belongings from at least 7 different women hidden throughout the property. Sarah Martinez's driver's license was among them. During the investigation, police discovered that Kowalski had been running this operation for over a decade, targeting young women traveling alone on remote highways. He would offer help with car trouble or directions, then overpower them and take them to the basement area where he kept them for days or sometimes weeks before killing them. The most chilling detail came out during the trial. Kowalski told investigators that he specifically chose to locate his station on that particular stretch of highway because it was so isolated that people would be desperate enough to stop there even if something felt wrong. He counted on travelers being more concerned about running out of gas than trusting their instincts about danger. The old Buick in the parking lot had belonged to Sarah Martinez. The "Help ME" message had been written by her during the brief moment when Kowalski had left her alone in the car while he went inside to prepare for whatever he had planned. She'd managed to write it hoping someone would see it and call for help, but I was the first person to notice it, and I'd been too scared to act. That guilt haunts me more than the fear I felt that night. I think about Sarah Martinez often, wondering if I could have saved her if I had been braver, if I had trusted my instincts, and called police immediately instead of just running away. The Prairie Rose Station was torn down 6 months after Kowalski's arrest. Now there's nothing there but an empty lot with some concrete foundations, and a sign warning travelers that the next gas station is 47 miles ahead. I still take road trips sometimes, but I'm much more careful now about where I stop. I always tell someone my exact route and check in regularly. And if a place feels wrong, even if I can't explain why, I trust that feeling and find somewhere else to stop. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly how to exploit our most basic human needs, like the need for gas when you're stranded in the middle of nowhere. They're counting on desperation to override intuition. And sometimes they're right.
My wife and I had been planning our anniversary trip to Yellowstone for months. It was going to be our first real vacation in 3 years, and we were both excited to get away from the city and spend some time in nature. We had booked a cabin just outside the park boundaries, and the drive from our home in Salt Lake City was supposed to take about 5 hours through some of the most beautiful scenery in the country. The first part of the trip was exactly what we had hoped for. Rolling mountains, clear blue skies, and that sense of adventure that comes from heading somewhere new together. My wife, Jennifer, was in charge of the music and snacks, and we were having the kind of easy, comfortable conversation that comes after 8 years of marriage. We were about 3 hours into the drive, taking a scenic route through some of the more remote areas of Idaho, when we saw her. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, walking along the shoulder of the highway. As we got closer, I could see it was a woman wearing a long, dark coat, despite the warm June weather. She was walking in the same direction we were driving, but something about her posture seemed off. She was moving slowly, almost shuffling, and her head was down like she was staring at the ground. "Should we stop and see if she needs help?" Jennifer asked as we approached. "She looks like she might be in trouble." I slowed down as we passed her, and that's when I got a good look at her face. She was probably in her 60s, with gray hair that hung in stringy strands around her shoulders. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was something about her expression that made me uncomfortable. She wasn't looking at us or acknowledging our car at all, even though we were the only traffic on this isolated stretch of road. "She doesn't look hurt," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Maybe she's just out for a walk." "Out here? There's nothing around for miles," Jennifer pointed out, and she was right. We were in the middle of wilderness area with no towns, no houses, no businesses visible in any direction, just forest and mountains and this narrow highway cutting through it all. I sped up and we continued on our way, but I kept checking my rearview mirror. The woman continued walking at that same slow, deliberate pace until she disappeared from view behind us. About 20 minutes later, we saw her again. This time, she was much further ahead of us, walking along the same side of the road in the same direction. Jennifer and I looked at each other in confusion. "That's impossible," Jennifer said. "There's no way she could have gotten ahead of us. We were doing 60 miles an hour. I had to agree. Even if the woman had been running instead of walking, there was no way she could have covered that much distance in 20 minutes. And yet there she was, wearing the same dark coat, moving with that same shuffling gait. "Maybe it's a different person," I suggested, though I didn't really believe it myself. "Maybe there are 2 women out here." But as we passed her for the second time, I got another look at her face, and I was certain it was the same person. The same gray hair, the same pale skin, the same vacant expression. She didn't look up as we drove by, just kept walking with her eyes fixed on the asphalt in front of her feet. This time, I didn't slow down. Something about the whole situation was making me very uneasy, and I just wanted to get to our destination as quickly as possible.
We drove for another half hour without seeing her again, and I was starting to convince myself that it had been 2 different people, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. The human brain isn't good at processing impossible things, so it tries to rationalize them away. Then we saw her for the 3rd time. She was standing directly in the middle of the highway. I slammed on the brakes so hard that Jennifer was thrown forward against her seatbelt. Our car came to a stop about 10 feet from where the woman stood, completely motionless, her arms hanging at her sides. She was facing us now, and for the first time, she was looking directly at our car. Her eyes were completely black. Not dark brown or deep blue, but black like empty sockets. And that vacant expression I had noticed before wasn't vacant at all. It was hungry, predatory, like she was sizing us up for something. "What is she doing?" Jennifer whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Why is she just standing there?" I laid on the horn, hoping to get the woman to move out of the road. The sound echoed off the surrounding mountains, but the woman didn't react at all. She just stood there, staring at us with those impossible black eyes. "Drive around her," Jennifer said urgently. "Just go around her." I looked to the left and right. The highway was narrow here, with steep embankments on both sides. I could probably squeeze past her, but it would be tight, and something about the situation made me reluctant to get that close to her. "I'm going to back up and turn around," I decided. "We'll take a different route." But when I shifted into reverse and checked my rearview mirror, my heart nearly stopped. There was another figure behind us, maybe 50 feet back, walking slowly toward our car. This one looked like a man in overalls and a flannel shirt, but he had the same shuffling walk, the same pale skin, the same dead-eyed stare. "Jennifer," I said quietly, trying not to panic, "don't turn around, but there's someone behind us too." I could see her hand start to shake. "How do you mean someone behind us? How did they get there?" I looked ahead again. The woman was still standing in the road, but now she had raised one arm and was pointing directly at us. Her mouth was moving, like she was saying something, but no sound was reaching us through the closed windows of our car.
The man behind us was getting closer. In the rearview mirror, I could see more details now. His clothes looked old, like they were from decades past. His skin had a grayish tint that didn't look natural, and there was something wrong with the way he moved. Too stiff, too mechanical, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice more urgent now. "Hold on." I floored the accelerator and yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending our car off the highway and down the steep embankment. It was incredibly dangerous. We could have rolled the car or hit a tree, but staying on that road felt like certain death. Our car bounced and lurched as we crashed through bushes and small trees. Jennifer was screaming, and I was fighting to maintain control as we careened down the hillside. Finally, we came to a stop against a large boulder, steam rising from our overheated engine. We sat there in shocked silence for a moment, both of us breathing heavily. Then Jennifer pointed up toward the highway. Both figures were standing at the edge of the embankment, looking down at us. The woman was still pointing, and now the man was pointing too. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching us, before they slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness that was rapidly falling over the mountains. We waited until we were sure they were gone before trying to start the car. Miraculously, it started, though the engine was making some concerning noises. We managed to drive back up to the highway using a gentler slope about a quarter mile from where we had gone off the road. The highway was empty. No sign that anyone had ever been there at all. We drove in silence for the next hour until we reached the first town with a motel. I wanted to continue to our cabin, but Jennifer was too shaken up, and honestly, so was I. We checked into a room and spent the night researching what we had experienced. What we found online made us question everything we thought we knew about that area. There were dozens of reports going back decades about people encountering mysterious figures on that particular stretch of highway. Always the same description: pale people in outdated clothing who would appear and disappear impossibly, sometimes blocking the road, sometimes following travelers. The reports went back to the 1950s, when a bus carrying a church group had crashed on that exact stretch of road during a winter storm. 23 people had died, including the driver and several children. According to the newspaper accounts, the bodies had been so badly damaged by the crash and the subsequent fire that many of them were never properly identified. Local folklore claimed that the spirits of the crash victims still walked that highway, appearing to travelers and trying to lead them off the road to join them in death. Most people dismissed it as typical ghost story nonsense, but after what Jennifer and I had experienced, we weren't so sure. We completed our trip to Yellowstone, but we took a completely different route home. We also reported our experience to the local authorities, though I could tell the officer who took our statement was skeptical. He was polite about it, but I could see in his eyes that he thought we were either making it up or had misinterpreted something mundane. But I know what I saw. Those weren't living people standing on that highway. The way they moved, the way they appeared and disappeared, those black eyes, nothing about them was human. The most disturbing part is that I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't been brave enough or reckless enough to drive off the road. Would we have sat there all night with those things surrounding our car? Would they have eventually found a way to get to us? Or worse, would we have eventually given up and gotten out of the car ourselves, only to join them in their eternal walk along that cursed stretch of highway? I've driven past that area twice since then, always during daylight hours and always with other people in the car. Each time, the road looks completely normal, just another piece of scenic mountain highway with nothing to suggest the horror that walks there after dark. But I'll never drive through there alone again, and I'll never stop if I see figures walking along the shoulder, because now I know that some roads are meant to be traveled quickly, without stopping, and without looking too closely at who else might be sharing them with you. The bus crash happened over 70 years ago, but some accidents leave scars that never heal, and some of the dead never really learn how to rest.
I work as a traveling nurse, which means I spend a lot of time driving between different hospitals and clinics across the Southwest. It's not unusual for me to be on the road at all hours, especially when I'm covering emergency shifts or filling in for staff shortages. I've gotten used to driving alone at night, and I've always felt pretty confident about handling whatever situations might come up. That confidence was shattered on a Tuesday night in March when I was driving from El Paso, Texas, to a small hospital in Roswell, New Mexico. I had picked up a last-minute shift covering for a nurse who had called in sick, and the drive was supposed to take about 3 hours through some pretty desolate country. It was around 2 a.m. when I realized I was running dangerously low on gas. My fuel light had been on for the last 20 miles, and I was starting to worry about being stranded in the middle of nowhere. The GPS on my phone showed a gas station coming up in about 5 miles, which felt like a miracle. When I finally saw the lights of the station ahead, I nearly cried with relief. It was one of those generic chain stations that dot highways across America, brightly lit and reassuringly normal-looking. There were 2 other cars at the pumps, and I could see someone moving around inside the convenience store, which made me feel safer about stopping. I pulled up to pump number 4 and got out to start filling my tank. The night air was cool and dry, with that distinctive desert smell that I'd grown to love during my time working in this part of the country. I was feeling relaxed and grateful for the first time in hours. That's when I heard the shouting. "Excuse me, hey, lady in the scrubs." I turned around and saw a woman walking quickly toward me from the direction of the store. She was probably in her 30s, with shoulder-length blonde hair and wearing what looked like a waitress uniform from a diner, white shirt, black pants, and a small apron. But something about her demeanor immediately put me on edge. "Are you a nurse?" she asked as she got closer, and there was an urgency in her voice that made me take a step back toward my car. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "Is someone hurt?" "My boyfriend," she said, gesturing toward a beat-up sedan parked near the edge of the lot. "He's in the car and he's really sick. I think he might be overdosing or something. Can you please come look at him?" Every instinct I had developed through years of working in emergency medicine was telling me that something was wrong with this situation. First, if someone was really overdosing, why wouldn't she have called 911 instead of asking a random stranger for help? Second, there was something about her body language that didn't match the urgency of her words. She seemed nervous, but not in the way someone would be if their loved one was dying. "Have you called an ambulance?" I asked, already knowing what the answer would be. "My phone's dead," she said quickly. "Please, you have to help him. He's not responding to me anymore." I looked toward her car and could see a figure slumped in the passenger seat, but the lighting in that part of the lot was too dim to make out any details. Everything in my training told me I should help if someone was really in medical distress, but everything in my gut told me this was a trap. "I think you should call 911, I said firmly. "There's a phone inside the store you can use." Her demeanor changed instantly. The worried girlfriend act dropped completely, and she took another step toward me. "I already told you my phone's dead. Are you going to help or not?" There was an edge to her voice now that confirmed all my suspicions. This wasn't someone worried about a sick boyfriend. This was someone who was angry that their plan wasn't working. "I'm not comfortable approaching a stranger's car in a dark parking lot," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I'll be happy to call an ambulance for you from inside the store." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating something behind her eyes. Then she smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile predators give their prey. "You know what? Never mind," she said. "I'll figure something else out." She turned and walked back toward her car, but instead of getting in, she leaned against the driver's side door and just watched me. I finished pumping my gas as quickly as possible, constantly glancing over my shoulder to see what she was doing. As I was hanging up the pump nozzle, I saw her pull something out of her purse. Even from a distance, I could tell it was a knife, long and thin like a fillet knife. She wasn't trying to hide it. In fact, she seemed to want me to see it. I got back in my car immediately and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I could see the woman walking toward me again, no longer pretending to be anything other than a threat. I backed out of the parking space as quickly as I could and headed for the exit. In my rearview mirror, I could see her running after my car, the knife clearly visible in her hand. She was screaming something, but I couldn't make out the words over the sound of my engine and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I pulled back onto the highway and floored it, not slowing down until the gas station lights had completely disappeared behind me. My whole body was shaking with adrenaline, and I had to pull over for a few minutes to collect myself before I could continue driving safely. That's when I realized I had made a terrible mistake. In my panic to get away from the woman with the knife, I had forgotten to pay for my gas. I knew I should go back and pay, or at least call the station to explain what had happened. But there was no way I was returning to that place, especially not alone. I decided I would call them the next day and send payment by mail if necessary. When I finally made it to the hospital in Roswell, I was almost an hour late for my shift. I apologized to the charge nurse and briefly explained that I'd had car trouble, but I didn't go into details. How do you tell someone that you fled a gas station because a woman with a knife tried to attack you after pretending her boyfriend was overdosing? The next morning, after my shift ended, I tried calling the gas station to explain about the unpaid fuel. The number I found online just rang and rang with no answer. I tried several times over the next few days with the same result. A week later, I was curious enough to drive back to that location during daylight hours, taking a longer route home from another assignment. What I found made no sense at all. The gas station was there, but it was completely abandoned. The pumps were old and rusted, the windows of the convenience store were boarded up, and weeds were growing through cracks in the pavement. There was a faded "for sale" sign near the road that looked like it had been there for years. I parked and walked around the property, trying to understand what I had experienced. This wasn't a place that had recently closed down. This was a place that had been abandoned for a long time. The pump handles were corroded, the price displays were blank and weather-damaged, and there was no way any of the equipment could have been functional. But I remembered clearly filling up my tank there just a week earlier. I remembered the bright lights, the other cars, the clean pumps that had worked perfectly. I even checked my bank account to see if there was a charge for the gas I thought I had pumped, but there was nothing. I started researching the location online when I got home, and what I found made my skin crawl. The station had been closed since 2003, when the owners had been arrested for running a human trafficking operation. They would target lone travelers, especially women, by having accomplices pose as people in distress who needed medical help or assistance. Once they got victims to approach their vehicles or go to isolated areas of the parking lot, they would overpower them and transport them to a warehouse about 30 miles away. The operation had been running for almost 5 years before it was discovered, and investigators estimated that dozens of people had been victimized. The woman I had encountered matched the description of Rebecca Torres, one of the accomplices who had been convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But according to the records I found, Rebecca had died in prison 3 years earlier from a drug overdose. I kept digging and found more disturbing information. Over the years since the station had been abandoned, there had been multiple reports of people experiencing exactly what I had experienced. Encounters with people matching the descriptions of Rebecca and her associates, always late at night, always involving some kind of medical emergency or plea for help. The local police had investigated several of these reports, but they always found the same thing I had found: an empty, abandoned gas station that couldn't possibly have been operational. Some people theorized that the traumatic events that had happened at that location had somehow imprinted themselves on the place, creating a kind of supernatural replay of the crimes that had been committed there. Others suggested that the spirits of the criminals were somehow trapped there, continuing to hunt for victims even after death. I don't know what the truth is. I don't know if what I experienced was supernatural or if there's some other explanation that I haven't considered. What I do know is that I pumped gas at a station that had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, and I was approached by a woman who had been dead for 3 years. The most terrifying part is thinking about what would have happened if I had been more trusting, if I had followed my medical training instead of my instincts and gone to check on the supposed overdose victim. Would I have simply disappeared like the other victims from decades past? Would my car have been found abandoned at that same location, with no trace of what happened to me? I still work as a traveling nurse, and I still drive those lonely highways at night when I have to. But now I'm much more careful about where I stop for gas. I stick to busy truck stops and well-populated areas, and I never, ever stop at isolated stations, especially ones that look too good to be true. Because sometimes the most dangerous traps are the ones that appear exactly when you need them most. And sometimes the people who seem to need your help the most are the ones you should run from as fast as you can. I also carry a small camera in my car now, and I've started documenting any unusual experiences I have on the road. Not because I think anyone would believe me, but because I want to have evidence if it ever happens again. So far, thankfully, it hasn't. But every time I see an isolated gas station glowing in the darkness ahead, I remember that night and I keep driving until I find somewhere else to stop. Because some places are meant to stay abandoned, and some people are meant to stay dead.